webinar. Hello and welcome to the Digital Poverty Alliance webinar, which is celebrating International Teachers' Day, albeit a few days late, and the vital role of technology in education. We have Russell Hobby, the Chief Executive of Teach First, here today, and I'm Elizabeth Anderson, the Chief Operating Officer of the Digital Poverty Alliance. We are going to give it a few minutes before we get solidly into the meat of this webinar, just to let everyone get in from the lobby. However, for those of you who don't already know about the Digital Poverty Alliance, we are a charitable coalition bringing together industry, government bodies, charities and the communities around the UK to end digital poverty once and for all by 2030. Our work revolves around bringing people together, joining the dots, advocating for national solutions to digital poverty, celebrating local ideas, and also gathering research and evidence which show the importance of tackling the digital divide. Our work includes the evidence review that we launched earlier this year at the House of Lords, and heading towards a national delivery plan, which will create a roadmap to how we bring everybody online by the end of the decade. We also run a number of proof of concept projects to help people who need support right now, whilst gathering more information about how those activities are helping to get people access to the services that they need. Russell, would you like to just give a brief outline introduction of yourself and the work that Teach First do?
Hi, yeah, real pleasure to join you this afternoon and talk about this topic. Teach First is a charity that is concerned with poverty in its most general sense, and we're looking at a future at the moment where about 4 million of our young people in this country are living in levels of poverty at a time when the world is becoming ever more uncertain too. And obviously there are lots of forces behind that, but what we're very interested in as a charity is how we can make sure that educational outcomes aren't predetermined by poverty, that young people can get the education they deserve, get the chances and opportunities in life that they deserve as well. And so that fundamentally comes down to how we can support schools who serve them. Teach First is probably best known for its teacher recruitment and leadership work, where we try and persuade, you know, the talent of our country to spend some time teaching, preferably spend their entire career teaching if they get the bug and want to do that as well, and make sure that they go and work in the schools serving the most challenging communities as well, because very often those schools don't get the teachers with the specialisms they need too. So that's one bit, but perhaps the best known of our work, which leads us naturally, I think, to digital poverty as well.
That's fantastic. You say it leads us on to digital poverty. What does digital poverty mean to you?
So I think digital poverty has a number of layers to it. And first and most obviously, it's the basic principle of access to all of the resources and opportunities that are online as well. And you know, even in this day and age, surprising numbers of homes, young people, families don't have the type of access that is making this conversation possible as well. So yeah, have you got the kit? Have you got the connection? Have you got the skills that enable you to make the most of that? Is it reliable? Is it of the same quality too? And you know, there's a very basic hurdle to overcome of making sure that that's universal, because there's just so much of participation in our society now, and I'm sure we'll talk about participation in education later on, but it extends far beyond that too, that if you haven't got a good internet connection and access, then you're just not going to be able to take part of it. But there's another level for me which goes beyond the raw access and connection, which is perhaps crudely put about the quality of the connection as well. And I think there are two angles to digital access. One is consumption. You know, can you read, view, see the kind of things that are available? And very often you can do that on a very basic device. You can do that on a mobile as well. And most young people do have a mobile. But there is so much more to making the most of the internet than just consuming what other people create. And indeed, if that's all we're doing, I don't think that's a very attractive prospect. I don't want to create a generation of consumers of other people's content. I want to create a generation or support a generation who create their own content, who are producers, who are active participants, who are in the debate, who are using the internet to, spread their own views, create their own content, build their own businesses, engage in their own hobbies and pastimes as well. And I think you need more than basic access to be able to do that. And again, if I put it crudely, like having a big screen and a keyboard is quite an important component. If you want to write blogs, for example, it's pretty hard to do that using your thumbs on the mobile. And I've tried in the past. If you want to get into e-commerce and all of these sorts of things as well, you need another level of resource. And I don't think it's enough to create a generation of consumers and think we've solved that. We want to create a generation of creators and producers. That's when we'll have solved digital poverty.
And I think that's really exciting, actually, the opportunities that being online actually give people. And absolutely, as you say, we talk a lot at the DPA about being able to access essential services, because that's the baseline that we feel that people need. But there's so much more, and actually there's so much more that kind of in society we just assume that everyone can do. Everyone can jump on eBay and sell things, everyone can blog, everyone could be creating a reel on Instagram if they had the confidence. Personally, not my area. But there's more that you can do, and there's more that you need. It isn't just about, well, if you've got a smartphone and you've got some data, then great news, you're online, that'll do. We do need to be making sure that people understand that this is part of a bigger issue. Also, just to say to our attendees, if you've got questions for Russell, do pop them in the chat or the Q&A, and we'll try and come onto those towards the end. Do also introduce yourself in the chat. It'd be lovely to know who we've got here today and why you've come along. So Teach First are part of the DPA Community Board, which we see as very much being the heart of the Alliance part of the Digital Poverty Alliance. Why did Teach First decide to become involved in that way?
Well, it was nice to be invited, so thank you for that. And I'm sure there were obvious connections between our agendas there. I think the sort of the journey, or the start of the thinking, was very much driven by the disruption caused by the COVID lockdown as well, and how we were discovering that that both schools did something quite fantastic, I think, in taking so much of their content and material, converting it to online provision, and then providing it. And I think one of the things that people forget a lot, I think, from lockdown is that eventually schools were doing two jobs at least at once. They were running a traditional school for the children of key workers and vulnerable children, and they were providing online learning. It took a while to get into the swing of that, but particularly by second lockdown, there was a lot happening there. But then that revealed the stark gaps that were emerging, because not every young person could access that online content or could do so in reliable ways. And again, schools were doing sort of fantastic workarounds on that. So there were people, they were printing stuff off and driving to kids' houses to drop the content off, but that's not a very sustainable way of doing things. But what I think it revealed is that when things go wrong, there are families which have spare capacity that they can adapt to the occasion. They have resilience, if you like, to the crisis. And there are families who are already living on the borderlines, and they're the ones that suffer the most. So if you were from a relatively affluent home, you had a laptop, you had a spare bedroom where you could study in, you had parents who had the time to be able to spend helping you with that work. And not every young person had that. Sometimes they were trying to view it from their phones. Sometimes they were across the table from their parents who were also trying to work online at the same time. Sometimes their parents were holding down multiple jobs and they just didn't have the time to be able to support and coach. So you just see how these gaps, which already exist, are widened by a crisis as well. And then so for us at Teach First, there was this sense that our basic mission to build a fair education system. We've always thought about quality of teaching, quality of leadership in schools. It seemed that the digital divide was a barrier to fair outcomes, and that if we're ever in a situation like this again, then we need to make sure that we have broader resilience. And then that starts you thinking about broader things. How many other things is our digital divides, preventing young people from being able to access as well. So that's why we became involved in the community board.
We know that the pandemic shone a massive light on the need for connectivity, and a lot of the expectations that people just had, that everyone's got laptops, everyone's got broadband, and actually the lack of thought that had gone into, yes, but if and you've got two parents trying to work and two kids trying to study, it's a laptop four ways very easily. Of course, a lot of the immediacy of the pandemic has moved, but the role of technology in education has evolved, possibly in part due to the pandemic and some of the shifts we've seen.
Yes, and sorry, you broke up a little bit on that. So if you can't hear me, then let me know if it's at my end on that one as well. Coming out of we're not out of the pandemic yet when it comes to children's education and their recovery for that. We are, we're getting data even this week around the attainment gaps that have emerged during lockdown at different ages. There's a whole sense of that. There's also gaps of mental health and well-being that are equally important as well. So we haven't recovered from the pandemic yet, and certainly the young people of our country haven't too. So we do need to continue to intervene, to provide additional support to those who fell behind. I think there's some really interesting opportunities in terms of tutoring and mentoring and coaching, and technology again can facilitate that. In theory, if we've got a potential maths tutor in one part of the country, they could tutor any young person in the country if they wanted to, as long as we're managing some of the safeguarding issues as well. So we should keep doing that, but we should just be building space for schools to do the work that they know needs to be done. The greatest protection for a young person is a well-functioning school with all of the resources that it needs. And actually, looking ahead, that's getting quite risky and challenging. It's not just the COVID recovery. We're in the middle of quite some significant political instability. We're in the middle of rising energy prices and the rising cost of living, some global turmoil as well. As a result of that, there's a pretty gloomy future to look forward to. I think it's really important that we think about how we channel funding and support to those schools who are serving the most disadvantaged communities, and how we also think about what happens the next time that this comes round. Hopefully there won't be one, but that would be risky to rely on that as well. What about the next pandemic? What about the next disruption to our education? Have we built enough resilience in there now? And can we do it now while the sun is still shining, rather than wait until we're in the middle of that crisis? A bit like we should be doing with broader vaccination challenges as well, prevention rather than cure.
And we are certainly living in interesting times. I think everything is a little bit unpredictable right now, and definitely we should be making use of opportunities while we have a little bit of flexibility. We know that young people who are digitally excluded did fall even further behind in that main part of the pandemic, and probably that's continuing to be the case. What should be being done now to enable them to catch up with their peers?
Yes, and I think I probably got a bit ahead of myself on that one. So I think some of the issues around tutoring and whole school support are the right ones as well. And then we can probably also think about it in more positive terms too. So far I've framed it as like, there's a problem, how do we stop this problem from happening? But can we go ever further and think about how technology can be used in different ways? And I think it's clear that technology cannot and should not be replacing the role of a teacher there. There is something very special about that personal relationship. And for all the online access that we provided, most young people were really glad to get back into schools when they were able to as well. They miss their friends, they miss their teachers too. So I don't think we should see technology in any terms as a replacement for the humanity within the system. But in what ways can it enable people to do what people are good at? which is the creativity, the ingenuity, the interpersonal connection as well. How can we take work away from teachers that isn't concerned with those sorts of things, lighten their administrative load, put data into the background rather than at the front of things, so that they can focus on that, make sure that resources are relatively readily available. And I know that at the moment there's a heated debate around the role of lesson plans and resources within the system, triggered by what I think is one of the great achievements of the pandemic, which was the Oak National Academy as well. Just a fantastic example of how the system can get together and push itself forward. But Oak continues, and Oak's aim is to provide resources. And to a certain extent, there's people saying, isn't that disempowering the teacher? Isn't that taking over the teacher's role here? I don't think that's true. I think that, you know, the ready access to the sort of best of what has already been created creates the space for then the teacher to innovate and adapt on top of that as well, rather than making things up from scratch. You know, there is a chance that geography lesson has been taught many times before, and so on. But that particular group of pupils will be unique for that. So teacher's job is to take the best of what has already been created, adapt it, rip it up, put it back together again, and make it work for those young people as well. So I think that's a good example of how technology can empower teachers rather than creating everything from scratch. And you look across at other professions, and you know, no doctor would think about researching and testing their own medicines and then bringing them into fruition. And doctors don't have any problem regarding themselves as high status professionals. Quite the opposite in that regard as well. How do we get that right balance? So I think there will be, you know, there'll be ways of how we think about what does teacher professionalism mean in a world of technology too, and how can we get to the good bits of the professionalism rather than the sort of routine bits as well. Sorry, I hope that perhaps slightly beyond where your question was, but I hope that makes sense.
No, it absolutely does. And I think there's a lot that we as the DPA would hope to do, but we think there's a lot that society can do to help teachers be able to engage with online as well. During the pandemic, of course, we did research which showed that around, I think it was about 46% of the teachers that we surveyed hadn't had access to the devices that they needed to be able to teach the classes. So of course, people talk a lot about whether the families had the machines that they needed, whether they had the connectivity that they needed. There was a bit less thought given to, if a teacher doesn't have the laptop that they need, this class is probably not going to be going very far. Our Tech for Teachers programme, we feel, provided vital tech during the pandemic for around 1,000 teachers in its first year. But how widespread do you think that problem is? Do you think there are teachers who don't have access to the right tech? Are they able to pass on the skills that are needed?
It's one of the more shocking findings of the pandemic, wasn't it? That even teachers themselves have struggled to get online, that there's digital poverty at different levels of the system. And perhaps not, you know, poverty might be a strong word from some of that, but they're just the quality of access that you require to be able to deliver a lesson well from your home, or to be able to, you know, do your work at home that you can then sort of take into school, or indeed inside schools themselves to a certain extent. And it is the case that schools' funding levels are quite different as well, and that some schools are relatively well funded compared to others, and that sadly, actually, those funding levels tend to follow affluence rather than counteract it as well. So it's often the case that those schools who do have the hardest job, who are serving the most vulnerable communities, are the ones who require additional resources and don't get them as well. So not every school is able to provide the kit that is required to teachers themselves. And I think when you look at the divide between private and state education, that becomes even more visible there as well. So where education ought to be acting as an antidote to disadvantage, sometimes it can be an amplifier of it, because we've actually pushed the resources to those who need it least rather than the most on that. So I do think there is that sense of which we've got to equip teachers properly, and we should better do that by funding by funding schools well, because we shouldn't be. And I think all too often teachers tend to pick things up from their personal items. They fly their own laptop, it's their own broadband connection, those sorts of things. It should be the school's duty to do that. And again, I've got to get this balance. It's got to be in proportion. The most important resource a school has is its teaching workforce and its support staff. It's the people inside a school as well. That's where we should be spending the bulk of our money on. We should pay the salaries required to get to attract the greatest talent into the education system. And then technology is nice on top of that. I know that may be a tough one to say in terms of a digital alliance, but I think we're all there, that we're there to empower teachers and help them as well. But then there should be enough money left over in schools to get that kit into the right places, and particularly those schools that serve more isolated or dispersed communities as well, that we should really be prioritizing those to make sure they get that access.
And we have tended to find that digital poverty, unsurprisingly, follows poverty, and that tends to be inner city communities, which tend to be very diverse. You might have lots of other barriers, English as a second language, for example. And then also, exactly as you say, isolated communities, coastal communities, rural communities who haven't had that same level of investment, but also in that same level of exposure to technology. And do you think that kind of follows in schools and in teaching as well? How could we tackle that?
Yeah, it's certainly true that poverty in our metropolitan centres and inner cities, particularly in London, is as acute as it is anywhere in the country. But very often in those areas, that poverty runs alongside visible opportunity and aspiration as well. And if you are growing up in the genuine poverty in London, you still only have to raise your head up to see the work opportunities that are around, that are just not available in every other part of the country. Particularly, I think some of those seaside communities which might rely on intermittent work through tourism, which at the very basic level, half of their terrain is water, and there's not a lot happening in those as well. The work opportunities are strictly limited, and that, I think, compounds the effect of poverty as well, because you can break out of poverty through education, but only if there's something to aim for there too. And it's not the school's fault here. We just haven't given every community in the country the kind of jobs that would justify giving up your valuable childhood to study further within this. Is quite a rational decision to be made. It's like, well, what would I do with this GCSE if I get it? And do I have to leave home and travel 200 miles away to make the use of it? I think that when we find that when we spread opportunity across the country, whether it be in terms of good work, whether it be in terms of digital opportunities and so on, we actually find the educational attainment rises to meet them as well. And very often we frame this debate the other way around. It's like, let's invest in the schools to create the jobs. I think it actually tends to flow the other way around, which is why that sort of the phrase that is sort of falling into disuse around leveling up is actually so important. Schools can't force families to think against their rational needs and in terms of where they should be spending their time as well. But if the local economy, housing and other things are working alongside, you find that schools rapidly can make the most of what they have to offer too. So I'd like us to spend a lot more attention as a country thinking about, well, what's schooling for and where does it lead to, and have we created the sort of led people through their education by providing sort of obvious career opportunities as well.
And I mean, it all comes into the point around some of the opportunities that the internet can present. Historically, industry, commerce, government have located themselves around cities because they need to be able to talk to each other, and just pragmatically, it makes sense if you're all in the same place. Whereas hopefully it becomes a lot easier to have dispersed teams, or even for organizations to either set up or move out into some of the more rural locations, coastal locations, because actually, really pragmatically, there's less cost, and with digital technology, it's possible to be out there. Do you feel that there is a role for teachers in helping children to understand, well, to gain the digital skills that they need, which of course okay, IT is a separate subject, but digital just flows through everything these days. So do you think there's a role for teachers in gaining and maintaining those digital skills and understanding the opportunities, or do you think that's a role for society, really?
Yeah, I mean, your first point in that around, that digital access does broaden the range of opportunity, I think is really true. There are more parts of the country now where you could live and still get access to the sort of jobs that have been typically, before the pandemic, were limited to quite a small footprint there as well. So I think there is a huge opportunity there to spread that more widely. And we can see it at quite basic levels, in the sense of, like, when we were doing work experience during lockdown, we obviously couldn't take young people in to businesses. So we had digital work experience there. They could log in and take part of that. Now, we got people coming from communities that are, hundreds of miles away from those centers of business and commerce, who were equally able to take part in that as well. So I do think the theory is there. I think it has to be run alongside traditional physical infrastructure as well, because I think, like, with the best will in the world, you're probably going to have to come in a little bit of the time to work as well, unless you're lucky enough to be in some of the very distributed jobs. You're still going to have to be able to travel in, so that still puts young people at a disadvantage. I also think that, ironically, one of the professions which is least able to take advantage of these digital working opportunities is the teaching workforce themselves. Like, remote working for teachers is largely a dream rather than the reality. And unfortunately, for those of us who are very much concerned with teacher recruitment, and trying to persuade young people to take up a role as teachers instead of sort of joining professional services or financial services or those sorts of things, is that the employment proposition is just not keeping up. They are able to work from home 1 or 2 days a week. They are able to access it remotely. They are able to get flexible working opportunities that are just not available in schools at this point in time. So there's a real risk there. And then your broader opportunity, broader question about what should schools be doing. I mean, there are a lot of young people who will be picking up the basics of digital literacy just through the way they live their lives at home, and others as well. And I'm keen not to crowd out what I regard as traditional academic subjects too, because I think that basic literacy, basic numeracy, an understanding of history and literature, and participation in creative activities are as valid those are digital skills as much as anything else. Those will help you thrive online too. But for those young people who can't pick it up, schools being able to provide some level of investment in the basic skills, perhaps in the way, rather than dedicated lessons, but in the way that they teach other lessons to maximize the amount of time, I think is useful. I do think we need to look very carefully at some of the trends in, so for example, the computer science GCSE that is on offer. Great in theory, but we just haven't equipped enough computer science teachers to teach to that level that's required, which means that actually well-meaning people who are just not as well equipped as they should be are teaching those levels, and young people are actually getting disillusioned from computer science as a particular subject, which I think is a tragedy at the moment. And again, it comes down to, like, are we training teachers? Are we equipping teachers? How do you get someone who's qualified with computer science? How are we going to persuade them to teach computer science at secondary school level when they could be going into a job with a salary 2 or 3 times the level of what they could be starting with? And now, luckily, some people will do that, actually, even if it's for a short space of time, because they know that unless we're getting the next level of skills on, then there'll be no future computer scientists. There are businesses like Amazon and Bloomberg who support us to support the computer science teachers to make sure their skills are current. And I think there's an argument to be made that even if you see your career in technology in the long term, 4 or 5 years in a classroom alongside your technical skills, that will put you in a leadership position that would be second to none. And I know that those sorts of organizations, they think, you've got a computer science degree and you can teach, you're a very attractive prospect in that regard as well. So I think there are arguments to be made, but there is that potentially a vicious circle that we're just not, unless we attract enough teachers with the technical skills in, we won't then create the next generation at university and so on. So I do worry about that.
Do you think there's more to be done within teacher training about digital and computing, or do you think it's more about attracting people who have already taken that leap and are computer scientists and getting them to want to give back?
Yeah, every teacher needs some level of digital literacy, regardless of what subject they're teaching. But so it's not just about attracting engineers and computer scientists into the profession, although I think that's important. But I am very nervous about trying to cram more into teacher training at the moment. As a teacher trainer, I just know how busy the basic curriculum is there for a new teacher to master for that. And even the early career framework, there's just such a lot that needs to be done. So I rather tend to think that it's the continuing professional development that is the angle of attack there. Every teacher is busy, unfortunately, so there's never a really good time to do it. But there might be like an argument for some very quick grounding in initial teacher training. But even then, there's critical topics that we're skirting over. We're not giving enough time to special educational needs within the system at the moment. So, there are other demands within there. So I would look to continuing professional development as maybe the source of that, and people can learn on the job and apply there. But I do also think that we should be, what can we do to attract more people with computer science degrees into teaching and other relevant subject areas too, that's a lot out there. I think the government need to look at bursaries to enable them to compete with the other opportunities. But I think organizations like Teach First, it's part of our job to say, there's a sort of two-pronged attack here. First is like, put your skills to really good use there. That this is an area where you could be equipping dozens, hundreds of young people with the skills they need to thrive in the modern world that we're creating. There's something very special about that opportunity. And then there's the sort of personal interest around, there's no better development in communications and leadership skills, I think, than being a teacher and spending that sort of time. So if we could put that pitch together, then I hope that we could address that. But it is a big ask, isn't it, when some of these people can walk into 60k salaries. So we need to look at teacher pay in the round too.
It definitely is a perfect opportunity for building leadership skills. I think if we look at the House of Commons, I think if people were more used to dealing with children, they'd probably be more used to being able to deal with them basically. But there we go. There's a lot of conversation at the moment about online safety. The Molly Russell case, there's been a huge focus around how children can stay safe online. And clearly, when they're using devices in schools, there's a lot of protections that are there to make sure that they're not looking at things that they shouldn't be able to access. How do you think that schools can better equip children that when they leave the school premises, they know a bit about some of the things that they should steer clear from in the same way that they steer clear in real life?
I think many schools are doing a lot in this regard. You only have to wander around and stuff to see the displays that have been put up as the sort of the residue of the lessons that they have taught in this regard. So schools, knowledge is power. Schools can equip young people with the insights to be able to keep themselves safe, but only to a certain degree on that regard. And so I think that one of the things that can be dangerous in our country is whenever we face a problem, our first thought is like, what can schools do to do that? I mean, when I was working for the union, I used to just keep a running list of like, schools must do X type stuff. There was worried about water safety, schools must teach swimming. Worried about knife crime, schools must teach children presumably not how to use knives. The opposite of that. You can, and there's not enough hours in the school day. So I actually think that part of the responsibility a lot of the responsibility belongs outside of schools with parents, with the technology companies as well. Schools can do all sorts about bullying and sort of anti-misogyny and those sorts of things. But if young people are on social platforms late at night talking about these sorts of things, how does a school protect young people from that as well? So while I am, I'm an advocate of technology, I am a big user of technology myself, and I think young people need to be taught how to use it. I also think that they need freedom from technology as well. There need to be boundaries with that, just like with any powerful tool. The younger someone is, the the less, the more boundary they need to be on this. So I actually think it's good that some schools are saying, like, we don't want a lot of mobile phone use within school time, because there should be times when you're not online. There should be times when I'm not online. When I spend lots of time online, I know that I love it, and there are many opportunities, but I know I need breaks from that, and I'm far less vulnerable to bullying than some of our young people. So I think there needs to be age limits in terms of access to it. And as someone has asked in that, I think there should be age verification. I think there should be times when we are encouraging young people not to be on their phones and on these platforms as well. There needs to be times when we're focused on good old-fashioned physical activity and clubs that are supervised with adults, so the youth services of our country too. So I think we should, treat technology as a powerful tool, which means it needs to be managed. Everyone needs access to it, but people need to be protected from it and created boundaries around it. And particularly when the younger you are, the more supervised access needs to be in that. So I'm not up for a free fall on this, because otherwise I think that it is potentially very dangerous for young people as well.
And great to see some questions starting to come through on the Q&A. Just picking up on what you were saying there, one of the questions is, what would you suggest that tech companies actually practically do?
Well, I do think some of these things around age, really taking seriously the age restrictions on these accounts. It is very easy to break through that. Young people are using these accounts much younger than we would agree is healthy. I think there's also, and this is going to be really hard, but there is something around the design of, which is well spoken about. The design of these platforms are designed to draw you in and draw you on as well. They are about attention. And they are very carefully designed, and many people have spoken about this, that just keep you coming back for more as well. And I think that actually we need to build breaks into this, and we need to design not to keep people addicted to our technology as well. And that is problematic with some of the business models, I think, around advertising too. But I do think if we want this the sort of public space online to be healthy, it needs to have limits to itself. It needs to be able to sort of people reach a natural stopping point and be able to leave it behind. But I think it's actually engineered for ever more attention, and because it's about attention, it does tend towards the more provocative, exploitative and angry elements of society as well. That's what gets clicks for there too. So it is all in the algorithms to a huge extent. And I think the tech companies' incentive is that these algorithms will draw people in. As a country and as a society and a world, we just need to decide whether we're happy with the algorithms being designed in that way, or whether we want to impose some limits onto that.
And another of our attendees has said, would you want some of the platforms to have limits to advertising or built-in stoppages and warnings, a bit like some gambling sites that are out there? And like campaigns against advertising high-fat content to children, that kind of thing.
Yeah, I think so. I think those are all sensible, but it's also, those are sort of the boundaries of it. But there's also the way that these attention algorithms are designed that runs right through this, which is very much about overcoming limits, really, and keeping people online and keeping people engaged as well. So there is something, we can put boundaries and limits around it, but we also need to think about the heart of our design. And again, this goes back to my very earlier point around, are we when we talk about digital access and ending digital poverty, are we just trying to create ever easier ways for people to consume other people's content? Or are we talking about ever easier ways for people to present, create, debate their own content as well? And I think the latter is potentially much more attractive, but much harder as well. And again, many many of existing sort of real world disadvantages just multiply that disadvantage online. And so again, if you're from a relatively affluent background, you can afford the kit that enables you to create, you can afford the training that enables you to create, you have the time and space to do that. If we built a, we could get universal equal access and still have digital poverty, because 20% of the population would be creating and producing, and 80% of the population would be consuming and being sort of told what to think. And I don't think that's not the outcome we're aiming for when we want to end digital poverty.
It's not, and as real life, digital life become ever more entwined, there'll be opportunities, and there'll also, of course, be pitfalls and dangers, and that is the way life works. But on the other hand, we have to believe that the opportunities that come from being able to collaborate, to find out new things, to learn new things, to train, to find work, to find best deals, all of that kind of stuff that comes through being online, hopefully that can outweigh all the bad that we've talked about. And I mean, we've got another question come through about how could young people be more included in design online to make sure that it's appropriate for them, but also presents the opportunities that they need, hopefully around their education and around opportunities to create content too.
Yeah, and again, to your former point, I'm not a Luddite on this. The technology can bring marvelous benefits too. The answer is not to run away from it at all. It's for technology to serve us rather than us to serve technology, I think, and to use technology to solve the problems it creates. I'm a bit like this on climate change as well. We could abandon all technology and so on, but then we would lose a significant standard of living. How can we use green technology to both solve that problem and create new jobs and other opportunities, and bring everybody up to the levels of energy consumption that those of us in sort of privileged societies take for granted? I think there's the same arguments in digital technology as not. But to the other question, I mean, I'm not an expert in user design and user interfaces. My marketing team will be the first to tell you about that as well. So I don't know the methods in this. I know young people are there and interested and available to be spoken to about it. I know that potentially this is great material for lessons within schools as well. That there's a focus group sitting there that if, as a company, you could be providing the schools with some resources and materials and kit as well, and in return, consulting young people on the designs, what they want out of it, what they're afraid of, what can stop them. I think there are many schools that would be there and willing to enable that, and would find it would be a great opportunity for the young people to feel included in those opportunities. So if the companies that are interested in that, they should be building partnerships with local schools and seeing what comes of it.
Brilliant. And another of our attendees has asked, how do you encourage digital capability to marginalized communities who have a lack of trust and that lack of exposure to digital services, and where suffering from imposter syndrome is found to be commonplace, frustrations of not being involved in decisions which actually do impact them the most?
Yes, and there's no magic bullet for that as well. It is the layers of all of the things that we have spoken about on here as well, in terms of is the kit there for that as much as anything. But then how can we work in a very patient and incremental way with communities? You build trust one step at a time, I think, and it's no good going in with glitzing, dazzling opportunities and so on if everyone will just wonder suspiciously, what is this all about? But if there's one small way that we can make people's lives a little bit easier for this, and you see this in schools as well, who are trying to rebuild the reputation from parents. You don't immediately come in expecting that parents' evenings are going to have 100% attendance and everybody will be giving you helpful feedback about what you should do. You go out there into the community, you become visible as a school leader, you do small things, and you keep small promises that gradually build that trust. And you know that it's a long-term job. You know that it's a 3 to 5 year journey to get this this as well. But schools, again, I think are in, you know, very useful places for some of this activity. They are in the middle of these communities. They are more approachable than some other institutions and organizations. Not everybody likes schools, but most people trust and respect their teachers. They don't feel too threatened by that as well. They have to come in and out on a regular basis, particularly at primary level as well. I think there are some opportunities there, and we mustn't, you know, just add that again as another burden to schools. There should be other agencies that can take the schools' physical and social capital and do some work on that as well. And again, perhaps to that idea of like talking, then using the schools as the venues, but getting parents involved as well as user groups and focus groups about service design too. And you could start with educational issues like the school's admissions process, for example, but you can quickly go into a whole range of local services there as well. So I do think that schools are, you know, they're very often the one part of the formal state infrastructure that people go to for good things to happen rather than to stop bad things happening. So could we make more use of that as well?
And I think that's something that's really important to us. We talk about the need for there to be place-based support and to go to where people are. And sometimes there are assumptions made about where people might be, but actually it doesn't necessarily mean that they go there. Whereas schools, actually, the vast majority of families, at least one parent is going to be stopping into the school sometimes. One of our guests has said, could schools advertise those other agencies and signpost to other trusted agencies, or would that be more burdens on the school team?
Yeah, and I think we need to be cautious on this. I think we've got to fund schools properly if we want them to pick up these broader challenges. And there was a time, sort of at the late 90s, early 2000s, where we were talking about the extended school, a sort of idea where that school would be that hub, and we would put doctors' surgeries on site, and there would be careers clinics and a social worker and all of these sorts of things. And actually, I think that's a brilliant idea, but it's not to be done out of existing budgets. You've got to equip schools to do that. I also think we've got to recognize that schools should be good at teaching. They're not necessarily good at, you know, community health services as well. So it is a partnership working model that school provides that kind of underlying relationship glue that other specialist services can be part of. But even that requires funding as well. So let's resource schools properly to do it. If then, and a lot of that then will be schools pointing to other agencies and other services. But I think then, because that is some burden, what can those services give to schools in return? So, you know, if schools can provide digital skills clinics that someone else could run, that could help, you know, if the school's got the space to do that in, but that could be getting parents into school that the school has struggled to reach in other respects. So that could be helpful to the school. Often you need a good reason for parents to come in, that's sort of a gentle entrance way, and then you can make sure the schools have access to others. So I think that point around a burden is a good one that we should be very aware of.
We are very aware, and I think a lot of people are very aware, that, you know, teachers are overworked, underpaid, but more than that, they just don't have the time to engage in the headspace to think about new opportunities. I know that even in my job, we have new opportunities coming through all the time, and they're really exciting, but you've got to be able to stop for a minute and think about what to do with that. And teachers, it's no different. But that's a really exciting idea about how, whether it's different agencies, whether it's businesses, whether it's charities, can work with schools. So what would be your shout out if there's people here today going, actually, I'd love to work with schools, I'd love to do maybe focus groups, I'd love to do digital skills clinics. What's the best way of approaching that in a way that doesn't sort of hit a teacher's inbox and they go, lovely, but?
Yeah, there is a there is a bit of overwhelm in schools there. So I think rocking up with a load of brochures or something like that is probably not going to get the response that people are hoping for as well. And it needs to be very carefully targeted to the school's working rhythms. I think that a lot of time I find that, you know, the pattern of school's day and when they can give attention and when they can't is quite different to that of other workplaces as well. The holiday cycle, those sorts of things. So sort of understanding how that works can help. But whether there are sort of coordinating agencies, intermediaries and third parties that can cluster some of this for schools, I think would be helpful. And you know, probably what I would be thinking about at the moment is trying to forge work with the multi-academy trusts that are around schools as well. So rather than 12 individual relationships with individual schools who lack that capacity, can partnerships be built with the trust that can then get it, that has the central sort of overhead that can then get it into individual schools' hands as well. Those might be some of the steps, but I think people should be aware that it will be a tough gig. But the other thing I would suggest is that some schools get a lot of help. Again, those that, you know, if you're a school that happens to be sitting near the City of London or something like that, you tend to find that there's lots of internship opportunities, lots of volunteers coming your way. Can you look for the schools that have been neglected, back to those communities that you talked about? How far can you go beyond your neighborhood to offer those opportunities? Because those schools won't have a regular group of people beating their doors down to do it, and those are the schools that really need the help as well. So try and look for those that are less well served.
I think that's really important for everyone to consider, because it's often London is the easy option, and we all know
Yes.
that London is the easy option. But I suspect that some of the challenges that the teachers on Teach First programs are facing, and some of the challenges around digital poverty, probably, if we were to look at a couple of maps, probably correlate quite closely.
Yeah.
If you had one call to action, Russell, around what could be done to help teachers tackle digital poverty in their communities, especially the deprived communities, what might that be? What would be the one biggest thing that would strike you as being super important?
The trouble with that question is that there's always, once you've solved one thing, then there'll be another bottleneck which is constraining that. So it is quite a layered approach to getting it right. But this maybe take us off topic, but teachers can get most things done if they've got the time and resources to do it. They're pretty creative, ingenious people who are there to teach, so they can teach many different things if you want them to. So for our disadvantaged communities, I would begin with saying, like, are we funding these schools properly so that they've got enough staff with enough attention space on that? Once you've got them, that they've got reasonable workloads with a bit of space to think and so on, then you will find that they can take up these wider opportunities, and any resources that you give them will be deployed well. So I'd start with overall school funding as if there is one magic bullet. I would do that, and then there's some of the things that we've talked about, you know, making sure that there are the partnerships are there, that people are ready and willing to work with the young people with those. I like the idea of that sort of user focus group stuff. I think that has great potential. People who have good kit that they're looking to donate can do those sorts of things as well. But I would begin with resourcing schools properly.
Ever the challenge.
Yes. And particularly so in this day and age as well. But you know, the fact that it's hard shouldn't excuse us from actually saying that that's the thing that needs to be done. Even if people can't do it, it's got to be said at the end of the day. And then it's for our governments to decide how to spend their money.
Definitely, and talking truth to power is always unpopular with power, but really, really important. Thank you very much, Russell, for joining us this afternoon. It's been a really fascinating conversation.
Thank you for having me. I've really enjoyed it, and there's some good food for thought in those questions. So thank you to everybody who gave them as well. Pleasure to join you.
Fantastic. Thanks to everyone who came along live. Thank you if you're actually watching this not live and you've joined us later on. If you do have questions that you'd like to continue the conversation, whether you weren't here live and you want to get involved, do join the DPA Community Hub. If you go on to digitalpovertyalliance.org, there's a Join the Hub button on there, and we will, of course, continue the debate on how to solve digital poverty by 2030. Thank you very much, everyone, for joining us today. Goodbye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.